Hi everyone. So a few days ago, I got an email out of the blue, and the subject was an invitation from two of your readers. I'm going to read the email to you. It said, "Dear Jules, my name is Benny Summers, and I am a first-year student at a radically progressive rabbinical school in Boston called Hebrew College. Recently, my dear friend and I finished reading your book, The Art of Losing Control. We met on Monday afternoon for weeks and would read aloud one festival stage at a time. In true style, we didn't go in order, but ambled through the stages at our leisurely whim. We started with the mosh pit and ended with the Forest of Wonder. We even managed to recommend your book to passers-by and friends who were curious what we were doing all those hazy summer afternoons. We wanted to study your work specifically in a dyad. In our tradition, it's called chevruta, and is the classic way rabbis and Jewish learners engage with ancient and sacred texts. We stop to ponder, elucidate, and challenge one another. Applying this method to your text was most beneficial. Normally, when a chevruta completes a body of text, there is something called a Siyyum, Siyyum, which is essentially a party that celebrates all of the learning and a chance to share that knowledge with a gathering of friends and family. This past Monday, as we sat together wondering what we ought to do for our Siyyum, I chimed in, why don't we reach out to Jules? We could have a Zoom Siyyum and share our reflections with him and directly share our gratitude for the learning. My friend Eli agreed, we might as well try, and so here I am writing to you this email, wondering if you might be at all interested in hopping onto a Zoom or Skype or whatever with two fans of your work, to laud you and share reflections with you. With respect, Benny Summers and Eli Witkin." Obviously, this was an invitation that I could not refuse. Every author longs for their books to find the right readers, for readers with care. So I happily said yes to this Zoom Siyyum, and this is a video of it. So nice to meet you guys.
You too, Jules. How have you been? How have you been holding up in this crazy time?
Yeah, not too bad. I'm living in Bristol. I moved to Bristol last year, which is a kind of not too big city in the West Country of England. So I got out of London, and I'm very glad I got out. I moved to this nice, small, friendly city that's very green. So lockdown's been okay here. I think, it could have been worse. We haven't been too badly affected by the virus. What about you guys? You in New York?
No, so we're both in Cambridge, in Boston.
All
so
right.
like in Harvard territory.
Okay, that's really nice.
Yeah. We're actually currently in Somerville, which is like, right next door. That's where we're in my back garden.
Okay.
Right now. Yeah. And,
they're good.
Yes, that's where
Well,
we're based.
it was a fascinating email to get from you both. You'll have to. I love the sound of this. The considered way you've been. It's every author's dream to have, two people have a ritual involving your book. So, tell me more about it, because I'm new to it.
Yeah, it was definitely highly ritualized. Eli, do you want to say a little bit about how it went?
Yep. So we began by, there's a traditional way we read many of our religious texts, which is called learning in chevruta. And the idea is that by reading out loud, by going slowly and picking things through and kind of arguing over things, arguing not in the sense of like trying to prove right or wrong, but like just like sinking into it together, two minds, something new can kind of flourish. So we did that, and since we've been distanced and everything like that, and we only had one book, how we did this really was Benny had the book and read out loud, and I sat and listened, which was also like a very interesting practice where Benny and I had very different experiences with the book, because he was reading it and I was listening. So there's this visual auditory disconnect, which also I think brought about we would bring up different gems out of the book.
Yeah. There were a lot of gems.
And so tell me about you guys, just before we get into that. So what are you? Do you work together, or you teach together, or are you studying together? What's
We've done a little bit of all those things, but Yeah, so I'm currently in school. I attend an institution called Hebrew College in Newton, Massachusetts. That is a pretty progressive, radical school training people to become rabbis and cantors and educators, you know, to go out into the world and to teach a type of Judaism that is based around pretty progressive ideas about inclusion, equity, expression, experiential facets of the tradition, and has a lot of time for contemplative paths, for ecstatic paths, for has a lot of curiosity around the ways that we could be blending different traditions together with our own, for the sake of, you know, perpetuating it in the long term, you know, in the broader community. So I started studying there last year, and I have 5 more years to go. It's a long program. It's essentially like getting a PhD in Jew.
Ha!
But,
And do you, what? And the end point is you might become a rabbi or
yes, so I will. So hopefully at the end of these next 5 years, I will become a rabbi. Mostly, I would really love to be educating and teaching and leading communities, specifically around a lot of the ideas that come up in this book. But I can talk about more of that later if we get to it. So that's what I'm doing. I'm in school. I'm you know, in that world, that academic headspace.
Okay.
And you know, I actually just finished academic headspace land and is going back to work. Would you want to say what you just did?
Yeah, I just finished my master's in education, and I'll be returning to the classroom to teach high school.
Okay, got you. All right, excellent. Well, listen, I'm in your hands, guys. I'm a guest, and so I'm happy to follow your lead.
Great. So we brought this bottle of champagne of beers as it's tradition for this when you finish a text that there should be a little bit of a drink. You know, nothing too crazy. So in your honor and the honor of the work that you put into this text, we're gonna do a little l'chaim, do a little toast, and then
I only bought a cup of tea. I bought a cup of tea. So you give me one. Great. Is tea okay? I can get something stronger. Tea's okay. Okay.
So we'll just say a quick l'chaim to you, to Jules, to the learning we did together, and that we'll hopefully really enjoy this time just digesting the learning and sort of sharing our thoughts and our reflections together. And thank you so much again for the opportunity to do this. So l'chaim.
Thank you, guys, and here's to you.
Cheers.
So
thank you for reading it with care.
We began all of our sessions, and we wanted to share this with you as well. We began all our sessions. There's an intention setting that we do, which is to just set our minds right. And the intention, which I think Beni sent to you, is pretty much it says that what we're doing is for the unification of things, that God is one, and that oftentimes we see the world in this and that, but really what we're striving for is like some sort of consciousness of oneness and to be in relationship with that. So we try to set our minds and say a quick intention to put our hearts and minds in that way. So we'll sing it.
So yeah, there's music to it, so we'll sing it for you. And if you're curious, I sent in the thread the Hebrew, the transliteration, and the English translation.
Okay, fantastic.
For your edification.
I'll follow it along.
Great.
So it goes like this.
Nice.
Good.
Yeah. So to go a little, so just to dive in here a little bit.
Yeah.
What I think the way someone asked me the other day how I found this book, because I was the one that brought it to Eli, saying like, I have this text, I really want to work through it, and I'd love to work through it together with you, because I had a sense that we would have so much to gain from like experiencing it as a dyad as opposed to just individually. And I can't actually remember how I came across it. It must have been through some algorithm or some type of suggested, oh, you like this book, you should look at this book kind of thing. Yeah. And I think it actually, if I really put my mind to it, I think it was an algorithm that was building off of a lot of Aldous Huxley. Yeah. So because right now, I think one of the theologians that I think is most exciting is Aldous Huxley. So I'm like digging into his Perennial Philosophy, and I'm coming across a lot of his material and a lot of academic papers I'm reading around issues concerning sort of the emergence of psychedelics as a therapeutic modality, and sort of like my curiosity around what are the ways in which the Jewish lens and the Jewish spiritual practice has, what do we have to offer to that emerging field, considering that, as you well know, so much of the history of the indigenous practice around many of these things has been lost to us in the West, and that there's just a lot of suspicion and animosity from the majority, I would say, of Christian-based practices around incorporating this type of stuff. But in Judaism, there's actually a lot of curiosity and openness, more so than I think people would realize. And I think partly that's because there's a lot of history there. Like recently, there was just an archaeological finding which showed that in the 7th century in the Judahite shrines that they found sort of like hashish, cannabis resin remnants that they were able to classify for the first time. So it's just showing that, these types of hallucinogenic compounds were an active part of ritualized life in ancient Israelite culture. So like, and that kind of tracks. And so I think that got me into thinking about Aldous Huxley, and then I think that got me into finding this book. So I think that was the path that got me there.
Well, that's, I mean, I suppose it's interesting in terms of my relationship to Aldous Huxley's work as well. I had been familiar with his stuff since I was a teenager. I've got a copy of the Perennial Philosophy from my school library that I stole when I was like 16. I've still got it. I was at the same school as him, so I nicked the copy. Where he was a teacher as well. He was a really bad teacher because he had bad eyesight, so the kids at the back of the class could just mess around and he couldn't see it. And he taught George Orwell, by the by. George Orwell was in his class. So you had the author of 1984 and the author of Brave New World in the same classroom. It must have been a very dystopian class, right? But it was when writing this book that I really got into Huxley. And, I just think he's the best theorist that we have about ecstatic experiences, because he has the psychological, he has the neurological and the chemical, he's got the historical. So he really kind of was a pioneer of like the history of ecstatic experiences, and saying, look, we kind of lost this stuff, and this is quite normal for other cultures, all the way up to the theological. So no one else has that kind of comprehensive view. And you were saying about how your idea is to integrate that which is separate. I mean, that's very much his way of thinking, like integrating these different disciplines and different views. So yeah, and now, I mean, from this book, I'm researching Huxley. My next book is about Aldous Huxley and his friends and family. So so it's got me very into that. And and I've been writing essays about the Perennial Philosophy, and also thinking about how he shaped psychedelic culture and its theology. I mean, he's had a huge influence on the theology of psychedelic culture, but he misses out stuff as well, where we can get into that. Because I think Judaism has, and Jewish theology has interesting kind of differences to Huxley's theology, I would say. But yeah, we can get into that.
Go for it. What would you point to?
Well, I mean, I wrote an essay for Eon magazine. I've written a couple of essays for Eon, one about ayahuasca and different theologies of ayahuasca, and one about Aldous Huxley's Perennial Philosophy. And in brief, what he does, because he wrote the Perennial Philosophy during World War II, and he basically thought there will never be peace in the world until we all agree on the Perennial Philosophy. This was his solution to World War. And so what he did was he said, actually, there is such a thing as a perennial philosophy because all the great mystics all report the same experience. They all have the same ultimate experience, which is like this unity with a divine light. And it's beyond form, beyond words, beyond culture. And he says, yes, some mystics have different kinds of experiences, like I, thou experiences, but they're bad mystics. They're like second-rate mystics. So he basically said, good mystics, it's like dissolution into the pure light. Bad mystics, I, thou encounters. And he wrote this without ever having had a mystical experience himself. But the point is that if you look at a lot of mystical traditions, including a lot of Jewish mystical traditions, they're not dissolutions into the pure light. They're I, thou encounters. They're relational. And likewise, if you look at a lot of psychedelic experiences, they're not pure light, ego dissolution experiences. They're I, thou experiences. So I guess what I'm saying is that we can appreciate the variety of mystical and psychedelic experiences. We don't have to say there is one ultimate experience, and then these kinds of I, thou encounters are lesser. Does that make sense? I've kind of plunged right in.
For sure.
Yeah.
You know, I often find myself thinking about how do people who encounter mystical experience adequately and appropriately divulge and disseminate their sort of developed belief based on those experiences to those who have not or maybe will not ever, you know, have a similar experience. And it feels as though that relational approach is in some way discernible and ascertainable by like just the general laity. Because it's something that can be mirrored in like the relationship between a parent and a child. In Judaism a lot, we often find language talking about the relationship to the divine as a relationship between parent and child, the divine being a parent, we being the child, and yearning for our father, yearning for, you know, a parent that's not there, but that is absent, but loves us still and wants to be with us. You know, that you find a lot of this type of language in the tradition. And it's beautiful and it's very evocative. And people across the spectrum of experiences can approach that material, absorb it, and sort of and mature and go through a period of maturation of their personal relationship to the divine through that type of language. Whereas I think, you know, asking people to conceive of melting into divine light, there's a disconnect there for so many people, and therefore it doesn't really have a lot of use beyond its own experience. Like in order to encourage people to live a life guided by the ethics and mores of, you know, any particular tradition.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so in terms of this topic, how had you guys come across this kind of topic before? Are you kind of considered like mystical experiences as something you were interested in, searched for, all that kind of stuff? What's your relationship to this area?
I would say we're mystics. Certainly. In our own ways. I'm trying to think about the ways in which I would say, like, both of us have a meditation practice that, and we share a teacher, and then have many other teachers, but we share a primary teacher who we sit with. And Beni runs a meditation group that meets in his house on Monday nights. It's a really sweet community, and we do 30 minutes of sitting and 30 minutes of singing for exactly the same purpose of like unifying our minds. Both of us have delved into psychedelics to our own amounts. Benny's really becoming like really a thought leader in like Jewish psychedelic thought, and thinking about how to use it as a healing and path towards thriving, and how to put ritual around it and really encase it in Jewish ritual. So we've kind of delved into that together, thinking about like, how can we use Jewish ritual to be the container in which we can lose control, which is something I think I really took away from your book, which is like, what are the situations in which I can put myself? What is the container that I build, and who is the proprietor of that container? Who is the person in whom I put myself? I put all of my trust that you are here. I will trust that you are to take care of me. And once I've let go of that need to do that for myself, and once I've externalized that into another, there's something about into another person and into a container that then allows. And what I loved really about your book was, both of us are festival people. So like the idea that you put the book in a festival like that, we loved. And it was amazing. It was like, really opened my eyes. It's like, oh, really? There is so many different avenues towards losing control, and losing control, ecstatic experience, mystical experiences, like all those are in some ways synonyms. I was finding.
Yeah.
But all of them, it seemed, had this shared idea of like, there's an environment that becomes a container, and there's a person in whom I let go into. I let go into the person, I let go into the container, and that is the thing that allows me to open.
Yeah. And I suppose for me, researching it, I had a sense that, you know, ecstatic experiences could be possibly messy, and that there were risks to it. But it was, you know, I guess, the stuff about war as an ecstatic experience and violence was a surprise to me when I researched it. I hadn't really thought of that. And, you know, I came across an early essay by Yuval Harari, the Israeli academic, and he'd written an early essay about combat flow, about soldiers having ecstatic experiences. And then there was another book I read called Blood Rights by Barbara Ehrenreich. I think she's a sociologist, American sociologist. It was also talking about violence as a means to ecstatic experience. But that made me realize a little bit that ecstasy in itself isn't kind of good or bad. Right. You know, it's the kind of, I don't know if exactly the uses you put to it or something, or it's how you allow it to change you and so on. But it can be definitely kind of antisocial and dangerous. I mean, Charles Manson and his followers were having a lot of ecstatic experiences. Osho and his followers were having a lot of ecstatic experiences. So, and I suppose, I mean, I was writing this book within the context of British culture, which, even though it produced like William Blake and the Beatles and Aldous Huxley, is not massively ecstatic. You know, the reason it produced these people is they were kind of pushing against, you know, and we have these occasional waves of ecstasy like Beatlemania, but on the whole, it's a very utilitarian, buttoned up culture. Yeah. And I was trying to find space for this kind of experience because I felt a bit claustrophobic in my culture. And when I did talks about this book in the UK, often it made people a bit uncomfortable, you know, so, but within subcultures, there's massive openness, like psychedelic culture, for example, or within like ecstatic Christianity. But within those subcultures, the risk is of a fetishization of ecstasy. So, you know, the place I got to researching this book was, don't push these experiences away, but don't hold on to them too much as well. You know, they kind of just happen.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, we talk a lot about is integration in this, because it's exactly like you said. It's like, how do I allow it to change me? Do I have this experience and then push against it? Like, no, I didn't want that. Or do I have this experience and then like go, like become obsessed with it and need more and more of it? Or do I allow this experience to say like, well, I've had this profound experience that on a neurological level oftentimes has the ability to like rewire or open up new avenues for my brain to be connecting, and therefore see the world differently, to rethink how I'm dealing with traumatic experiences, like all these different ways. And Beni's giving this language that we talk about of like healing and living towards thriving. And these experiences can, if we're open to it, have the ability to help us move in those ways. But integration and how we make sense of the experience is a really important phase in that.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose when I was researching this and writing this, I'd had powerful experiences, which to some extent I hadn't earned. Like, you know, when I was 23 or something, I had this near-death experience, which was very, very, very life-saving. I mean, very helpful and life-saving for me.
Yeah.
And I was, I guess, trying to get back to that and trying to make sense of that. And in some ways, you know, I don't feel I particularly arrived at stable answers writing this book. You know, halfway through this book, in fact, early on in writing this book, I became a Christian. And then after about a year, I decided, actually, I can't legitimately sign up to the A, B, and C.
Yeah.
And how awkward, because I'd announced it to my newsletter, all this stuff, you know, and being a Christian in the UK is not what it used to be. Like, and now it's a bit weird, you know, like, which is very unfair of my culture. But so I remember halfway through the book feeling a bit lost and thinking, oh, what have I got here? Like, but I suppose I ended up in a kind of like optimistic agnosticism. Like, I'm sure there's something, and I'm pretty sure that it's good and kind, but I don't think I'm ever going to know for sure what's going on in these higher levels. So I'll just try and get on with my life here and be a good person.
Right.
But you guys, you have the benefit of this tradition of this you know, millennia-old tradition you're in. So how does that affect, you know, your attitude to this kind of thing?
I love that question. I think for myself, I'll just say quickly, sort of as a preface to a response to that, is that the very first sort of true to form mystical experiences I had were in sensory deprivation. I became a real sort of float tank evangelist a number of years ago, and sort of, which is sort of the opposite, like, of what many people consider to be the precursors to ecstatic experiences, with like lights, sounds, colors, movement. You know, you're like one with all the dancing people, and then all of a sudden, right, this is sort of very much like total nothingness, right? And it is, and I think what did it for me from that perspective is that we have in sort of the Torah, you know, the creation story says that that things were created from nothingness, right? From tohu va'avohu, from just like formless and void. And then from that nothingness, something was able to emerge, right? And so spending a lot of personal time in like a nothingness space, like, actually facilitated my very first ecstatic quasi-mystical experiences, which then opened me up to wanting to explore other headspaces and other realms of consciousness, with greater earnest and with greater maybe like rigor behind them as well, with the rigor of ritual that I had inherited.
Right.
And I think for me, you know, something that came to me in some of those sessions was, you know, I don't know why, but I have been born into this tradition, and for better or worse, I am a Jew, right? And for whatever that comes with, I accept it. I accept the peaks and the troughs and the highs and the lows of what that entails. But that sort of just like deeper acceptance of my lot in this universe in this iteration of consciousness, you know, sort of allowed me to soften into some of the more prickly aspects of a deeper engagement with tradition, which is like the language, like knowing the Aramaic and like knowing all the ways in which that my predecessors really like tried to keep things in elitist format, and then there were movements in like the Hasidic tradition to like push against elitism and sort of bring it to the people, and there was like a reformation to that and a counter reformation, and so all of that has happened within the tradition. And so when I reflect upon what having a tradition has done for me in terms of my personal scope on everything that's going on in the universe and everything, it sort of allows me to say, like, I'm never going to know, but I do have the benefit of the inheritance, like this gorgeous inheritance of millennia of thinking and musing and contemplating around these things, that I don't have to reinvent the wheel, and that it is my birthright to like pick from these different strains of our tradition, so that I can weave something together that I can then offer, give over as an offering to the people around me while I'm alive. Right. And I think that was a big part of helping me decide to go to rabbinical school, was deciding that, you know, again, for whatever reason that it's been deigned that I'm going to be a Jew, that like I get to do my own sort of like taking different composite elements that speak to me, that resonate with me, and then I can create something from that and then give it over, and then that will be dissected and taken apart by future generations, and they'll do what they do, you know, whatever. But yeah, I think
it makes total sense. And I love the word prickly. That's exactly how I felt trying to be a Christian. Like I was wearing a prickly jumper, and I just took it off quite quickly. I had a low tolerance for discomfort.
For sure. And I think to go with that analogy, what my ecstatic experiences allowed me to do was to soften. And the softening actually allowed the prickles to sort of sink into me, become part of me, and then they didn't hurt anymore. They were they were actually the things that stuck the hardest to me.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that's what I would say about that.
I don't even remember what the question was.
Well, I suppose it was about, I mean, in some ways that book, and I don't know if it was the right kind of mission, I was in some ways trying to say two questions really, like, well, three. How do people find these kinds of experiences today in modern Western culture? Two, to what extent are they good and bad for you in a kind of pragmatist William James type way? Like, does it lead to flourishing or not? But three, I was also asking, what do they mean? And the three was, I suppose, the really personal question for me. And I feel like I didn't really massively succeed. Like, what does it say about the universe, about the spirit world, about the nature of reality? And I think that third question, I to some extent feel I waved a white flag. I was like, and ended by saying, I don't know. I almost feel like more unsure by the end of the book than I was at the beginning. So I guess I was curious about, for you, within the kind of the Jewish tradition, like what do you think these experiences are? Do you think they're like going to kind of deeper levels of your self? Do you think it's connecting to the divine, and the divine appears in different forms, or, you know, it's a tricky question.
Well, one thing I'll say is that your honest searching, I thought came through in the book, which I appreciated. Whether it was good for you as a person or not, I will say as a reader, it came through very. I mean, these are tricky topics, especially as you said, like in your culture, and I think in a lot of American culture too. People are nervous about such experiences, and it came through very genuinely. Of like, we were reading the book, your voice came through as, we're not sure, and like actually there are part of the research is all the negative ways that these things come about, and all the very reasonable sociological reasons why we built a culture that was nervous about such experiences. Like that all came through. So I'm sorry you didn't find your answers, but it was beneficial to me.
I think something that at least I'm trying to locate more and more as I delve deeper into the tradition, and as I learn from people like Eli, who's already in many ways a deep purveyor of some of the best parts of this tradition, is that there's something about mystery that is perennially overlooked in many cultures, that like especially in the West, like we can't abide mystery. That mystery must be somehow illuminated so that it no longer occupies the position of the unknown, because the unknown is the realm of the fearful, the realm of the uncertain, the realm of the unformed. But really, that like to abide mystery is to sort of be in a deep sense of tranquility and equanimity with all things. And if that's, that seems to be what so many of the mystical traditions are espousing. It's like, if you can just abide the fact that you don't know and you will never know, right? And you can just bask in the glory around you, all the things that are going to remain mysteries to you. just be cool with that. Like,
yeah.
you know, and then all of a sudden it's just like, oh, okay, like everything is mystery, and like, you know, I don't know. I feel like my Judaism more and more makes space for that.
Yeah.
Makes space for abiding the mystery, and
Yeah.
that's what I'm going to continue to develop is the capacity to do that, you know, with grace and with a sense of, hopefully with a sense of ease, but
Yes.
it's definitely not me right now, for sure.
Yeah, I appreciate that. There's, I mean, a book I read, I've been, you know, researching Aldous Huxley and his friends, who they left Britain in the 30s and moved to California, and they kind of dodged the draft, and moved to California, and then eventually became these kind of leading figures in the hippie counterculture, which is very unlikely because they were uptight Brits. But one of them was Alan Watts. I don't know if you read him at all. Alan Watts. Yeah.
Yes.
So
yeah.
Did you read The Wisdom of Insecurity? So Watts wrote that he became an Episcopalian priest, having written about Buddhism since he was 17 and obviously been a Buddhist, or maybe a bit of a Taoist as well. He then became an Episcopalian priest, I think also partly to dodge the draft. He was then kicked out of the church because his wife accused him of being into like spanking and polyamory, which is probably true, but you know, like, so the Anglican Church accepts a lot of things, but I think that was too much. So he got kicked out, and then he wrote a book called The Wisdom of Insecurity, and it was a lot about accepting not knowing, and accepting also being a bit in between traditions, and resisting the urge for kind of certainty. And yeah, I guess I appreciate that. A friend of mine, he wrote a little book about this, about he called it negative capability, which was Keats's term, the poet Keats, about the ability to exist in doubt and darkness without reaching for too much certainty.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that takes, I mean, I don't know how you do that, but for me that's partly a physical practice. It's like being okay with a bit of kind of anxiety in one's stomach and that kind of thing, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. My perspective on what does it feel like, or what does it mean to abide in the mystery, and like in like a practical, like on the ground way. I think for me, it comes through when I'm encountering a new human being for the first time, or when I'm encountering like my significant other, or my parent, or my dear friend. You know what I mean? And recognizing that, like, I think one time we were together in a retreat, like a just a 2-person retreat, and I looked at Eli and I was like, "What's it like to be you?" You know, like, I have no idea. I'll never know what it's like to be any of these people. And when I walk around the streets of the city and I see all of these other human beings walking around, recognizing that to them, I'm just a non-playable character in their first-person video game. You know, I'm just a background element, you know, even though I have a deep, complex existence, according to the rest of the human race, even the ones that know me, I'm just a mystery, right? Yeah. Truly. And so, like,
we're mysteries even to ourselves a little bit.
Indeed. And that's what I think becomes so exhilarating about both the psychedelic exploration process, but also just the process of the mystical path, is to contend with the mystery of the self, right? In a very genuine, open way, as opposed to in a fearful sort of like needing to control kind of way. But just to be like, wow, like here's a new level I didn't know existed, and I'm sure there's umpteen more levels that I'll probably never get to access, but probably are there, right? And wow, what a crazy thing to consider. In doing so, I find that I'm more patient. I find that I'm more willing to be wrong, and more willing to accept when I'm wrong, which seems to be a healthy behavior for relationships in my life. So, I mean, that might be.
And I guess certainty is shutting down information, which the brain needs to do a bit, because the brain is getting so much information. that it needs to shut down because otherwise it gets flooded. And this is something Aldous Huxley talked about, and others as well. They had the idea of the brain as a kind of reducing valve.
Oh, right.
And psychedelics opens it up. So, but I suppose habitual expectations and very entrenched beliefs are that kind of reducing valve.
Yes.
And when you accept a bit of uncertainty, then you're just open to the stuff that you might have overlooked, the little, which is that state of wonder is the psychedelics can get one in, where you just like, the strangeness of a word or the orangeness of an orange or this kind of thing, but yeah, that's interesting.
Totally. Something that we were talking about a lot, it came up several times, and we'd love to get your take on it, is the phenomenon that you spoke about a bit in the book, and that I've come across, at least personally in a lot of my own research, around what happens when you push the limits of the sympathetic or the parasympathetic nervous system so much that it cascades out of one setting and immediately into its opposite, right? And that's sort of, and in that moment of that cascade breakthrough threshold, whatever you want to call it, is the ecstatic, right? The ecstatic is that sort of like revolving door shift, from being activated to being, deeply relaxed, or from being deeply relaxed and satiated to being hyper activated and stimulated, right? And sort of, we've been trying to think of a word for it. Like, how can we use language to wrap up that process, that phenomenon? And I don't think we've come up with a
yeah. I mean, I think that is the ecstatic, but it's not all of the ecstatic. That's one. I mean, I guess I'm thinking about, for example, the kind of restfulness you feel after very intense dancing. And people talk about it in ecstatic dance. They get to that point, that kind of click, which alcoholics would talk about with booze. I think it's Tennessee Williams talking about drinking until you get that click, and then you're at peace, which is obviously dangerous and addictive. But you can get that healthier with dance, where you get to that peace place, that the kind of quiet and so on, and the brain's quieted down, and you've gone into some kind of body knowledge or something. Yeah, and I'm familiar with that kind of, and that's what is it? That's the parasympathetic nervous system getting so aroused that it switches into the kind of the rest system.
No, it's the.
Oh, it's the other way around.
It's the sympathetic getting so activated that it clicks into the parasympathetic, which is a relaxation system.
Yeah, which is interesting, and people can do that through pain as well, right? This is why people get into stuff like self-harming, maybe, or like S&M. They talk about the kind of completely peaceful state that they get into. I've had experience of that from dancing for sure, and from sport as well. There's stuff like runner's high, and and you kind of like really, really, really tired, and then suddenly like in the peaceful plateau. I've had less from because I probably am not very experienced in kind of contemplative stuff. So I've had fewer of the opposite kind of experience of the real stillness, and then suddenly, what is it? So tell me a bit more about that. It's like sudden flow of energy after the kind of stillness.
Yeah, the way I think about it is like any two things can make a line. And become opposites at the bowers, which are their ends. But we started this with, if I'm orienting my mind towards oneness, I can understand that, like, I don't know if you can see this, if I have a line where this is one extreme and this is another extreme, the reality of the situation is that line ends up bending around to be a circle. And it's like, but it's in this moment where the two things are so opposite each other, they can't actually come together to make that circle. But there's some sort of mystery, godliness, ecstaticism, something that's happening at that point that can hold this circle together. So there's a point, it's not like you can't walk towards the parasympathetic and then, how do you get to the sympathetic? It's like the line has to come around in a circle in some way.
Yeah.
And you asked me, like, how do I think about it in terms of my Jewish practice? I think about it that way too, in terms of like, there are many people in Jewish life that follow this, that, or the other strand of thoughts. So like there are the extreme rationalists who think in a very like Aristotelian logical way about law, and that's how they organize their Jewish life, and that's a way that they have closeness with the divine, is through like a very detailed Aristotelian way of thinking about law. And that's like deep, and they get in deep study, and through their deep study and finding like minutiae, whatever, they find flow states in that as well. And then there are the mystics who like believe much more in experience and are finding it the other way. And right, but it doesn't matter. And that's what I liked about how you did your book, is like, it doesn't matter where in the festival do you want to go.
Yeah.
You can end up at the same place.
Yeah.
And by the way, we wandered around the festival. We did not go in order. I think if you're curious about what we did, we started at the entrance gate, but then we went directly to the mosh pit. Then we went to the contemplation zone to just like chill out. Yeah. Then we went to the revival church, get some energy flowing again, so that we could then go to the psychedelic wonderland and just like totally blow ourselves up. Yeah. And then we went to the Tantric Love Temple to feel that like sense of like connection. Then we went to the cinema. Then we went to Futureland. Then we went to the rock and roll main stage, and then we ended in the forest. Because that's something a place that we both like, most that's connected
cool.
Is, like,
that's cool. I could have written it like that. That would have been a very different, like, I suppose I attempted to have some kind of narrative thing, but I would have probably written it differently, and I could have done that. It reminds me, I mean, some people have written books where you can shuffle them and read them in any order. There was an Argentine novelist called Cortázar, and he wrote a novel like that, where you could read in any order. But that's good, isn't it? Well, if you create a festival, people aren't going to follow the path, are they? They're going to wander around.
Exactly. That is exactly right. Well, we're at a festival. We might as well just do what we usually do.
Yeah. I mean, so this book came out in like 2017, and I've been working on it a few years. I've been working on it 4 years. But I feel now like, like 3 years later, I could have put a lot more in. Like I hadn't done psychedelics when I did that book for 20 years. And I wanted to, having researched psychedelics and researched all this interesting new, the new studies, the new papers that were coming out, the new studies about psychedelic therapy in a safe space, it piqued my interest very much and made me think, I want to do psychedelics again, even though the last time I'd done it, I'd had a bad trip when I was 18 and been a bit traumatized from that. So I really wanted to, but I didn't want to do psychedelics before the book came out in case I went crazy, because I didn't want to have to do the book tour if I was crazy. So the book came out in 2017, and then in September, October 2017, I went to do ayahuasca in the Amazon. Went to a kind of 10-day retreat and did ayahuasca, 5 ceremonies. And that was just so fucking interesting. And I wrote a little book about that called Holiday from the Self, which is a Huxley quote. He talks about, humans seek these holidays from the self. The self is kind of boring, a boring cobbled together fiction. So we need occasional holidays. Yeah. I mean, yes, that it was like a bungee jump into Amazon indigenous culture, which is so different. It's like an animist culture. It's like a curse culture where, I realized how differently Westerners and indigenous people in the Amazon view what ayahuasca does. Like Westerners think of ayahuasca as it helps you uncover your trauma and find healing and grace and, and so on. Indigenous people think it helps you find the person who secretly cursed you and get revenge. I mean, that's a massive generalization, but it's, so it's a completely different modality.
Different.
Yeah. But,
that's something really interesting we talked about in the forests, which was this idea of when I experience something that is completely foreign versus when I experience something that is completely mine in my culture, my song, my inheritance. Like, for instance, like a bar mitzvah is like an easy example for me.
Mm.
Like from the day I was born, I knew that was coming. And like growing up, I went to other people's bar mitzvahs and I saw what the ritual was, and I saw my brother go through it, and I saw my community members go through it, and I saw my friends who are a little older go through it, and then I went through it, and then I ushered people who were younger than me go through it, and it was like that wasn't foreign ever. And I knew, and like, you know, there's certain things that happen at a bar mitzvah that the whole community knows what's going to happen and how it's going to work and how they're going to usher me through it and like everything like that. And what's interesting is we've lost, I think, something in your book you talked about so much, this like historical sociological of where the West has lost so much of these practices. And I'm left with these deep questions of, I don't want to recreate, and I don't want to create anew, but I'm left without something that's culturally, societally holistic, that's like mine, and that I think of this a lot as a educator. Like, how do I give my students something that we're not building from new, but they don't have ancestors who can walk them through it, but I want them to have the experience, but I want them to have the experience communally, but I can't do that unless we start now. So it's like,
yeah, I think you put your finger exactly on it. And it's interesting to hear that it's a challenge for you guys as well, because I was thinking, well, maybe this is just me as the deracinated individualist, the spiritual tourist, having to, you know, go to the Amazon jungle looking for kind of connection, which is kind of paradoxical, right? Because yes, you have a very meaningful experience, almost beyond your capacity to make meaning of it. There's almost an excess, because it's alien. And it's funny when oftentimes when people smoke DMT or do ayahuasca, they have kind of alien type experiences because they don't have the terms for it. They don't have the rituals for it. So you just end up with a what the fuck experience, you know. That can be like that sometimes. But so it's interesting to hear that for you as well, more embedded in this very rich culture, that it also you find a bit of like that there's maybe something missing a bit of the, is that what you're saying, Eli? That sometimes within your culture you feel that there's the also Jewish culture has maybe lost a bit of access to that to the ecstatic.
Well, yeah, it depends. It depends. Like, you know, the Jewish culture is also not one thing. Like,
well, yeah. I mean,
like I've through my life floated through many different aspects of the Jewish culture. I've gone on a long journey through different countries and different cities and different relationships with my mother, and and so like I can also see what each community. You know, I kind of get to a point where I was like, wow, actually, I ran away from the community I grew up in search of something else because I was longing for something. And then I got there and I realized the place I got to didn't have some of the things I loved about what I grew up with. And then I was like, oh, every place is flawed and everything has its. So I think it's a little bit of trying to, it's trying to like pull everything towards each other a little bit. It's like, oh, well, that really insular community has what I'm talking about in terms of like deep ritual, in terms of like communal knowing. But what they don't have is like an openness to the world and like a more fluid boundaries where we can actually talk and learn from the culture. So how do we share both of the things?
Yeah,
there's a give and take and there's a loss. So it's
yeah. That's interesting. Yeah, I mean the essay I wrote on the Perennial Philosophy, on Aldous Huxley's Perennial Philosophy, it kind of says that the perennial philosophy doesn't really exist, and what it does in fact is it kind of does a ranking of different types of experience, and like I said, it says this is the ultimate type, this is lesser, and so on. So it's not really perennial, which is fine. Just don't pretend to be perennial. Just they say this is what I'm into. I think this is true, but that's okay. Rather than saying, you know, this is genuinely a universal thing. And at the end of the essay, I read a Christian theologian called Keith Ward, and he talked about something, I think he called it sympathetic inclusivism, which is like a technical term. And what it means is you say, look, this is what I'm into. This, I think this is maybe the best path to the divine, or at least this is the path I'm most into. And I would, and I would put it forward to other people and recommend it. However, I appreciate that God is greater than any construction or any culture. And I'm sure that other traditions probably get at something that my way misses. So, this guy, Professor Ward, he talks about like interfaith conversations and encounters and meetings and dialogues, not as just something nice and extra, but actually something very rich where you can see aspects of God that, you missed. So that I like,
Sympathetic inclusivity, is that what it is?
So exclusivism is my way or the highway. Like my way's right, everyone else is wrong. A Christian's going to heaven, everyone else is going to hell, and so on. Perennialism is they all really agree. There's no, actually at the mystic core, there's no differences. That's not quite true either. Inclusivism is there is truth in many different paths, but I still think like my path is, I still prefer my path. So you're recognizing differences, but you're also saying, yeah, there may be some truth, something of value in other traditions as well.
I think something that came up in the text, which was like a little point, but that really like stimulated us, was your use of the term Balrog, the Tolkien term Balrog, to talk about these deep upwellings of subliminal content that we reckon with our whole lives that can have really monstrous effects on our external environments and our external relationships if they're left unchecked and unbattled. And sort of one of the things that I think is perennial, or that I perceive to be perennial, is that we're constantly in the course of the mystical path and engagement with ecstatic experiences. The Balrogs are going to show themselves, and they're going to make themselves known. Whether we've gone to therapy and sort of contended with them in that setting, or whether we've had moments where we had like spontaneous mystical experiences and the Balrogs made themselves up, but they're just going to constantly be there reminding us of the pitfalls of, as you say, fetishizing any one path. That if I fetishize the mystical path of Judaism, I have to also remember that there are Balrogs in the Jewish path and my relationship to Judaism that are real and that purports to pull me down.
Right. Yes,
so
you're absolutely right. And yeah.
And we just love, like, we've before we read your book, we had used that exact language of the Balrog to talk about instances, to talk about instances of internal battles. And so without having to go deeply into it, I'd just be like, I'm dealing with a Balrog right now. And we'd be like, we would just get it. We'd be like, yes. And so when we read it, we were both very titillated. We were like, Jules knows.
That's awesome. It makes me think of like every culture has its good points and its shadows. And I think a lot of people in the West, in the UK and the US, left Christianity because of its obvious shadows, abuse, patriarchy, and so on. And then they either turned to New Age culture or to Eastern religions with a naivety, and then were horrified to discover that either New Age culture or Buddhism or Hindu communities also have their shadows and Balrogs. Likewise with indigenous shamanism. They bring these absurdly idealized, abandon Christianity. It's all so rotten. But this indigenous Amazon shamanism, wonderful. No shadow here, and then constant what's the word, demystification, and that's really the story of the 70s in the New Age culture, over and over. It's very difficult to find a Western Buddhist community which has not had major sex scandals or power scandals, and it's been so it's been a kind of constant education. So, and that's from on a community point of view, and then on the individual point of view, you get the Balrogs of like grandiosity is a big problem with ecstatic experiences, and lack of critical thinking. I mean, within, I guess, what I think of as my culture, though I'm really having thoughts about it, which is kind of like New Age culture, you know, that kind of like Aldous Huxley, spiritual but not religious. I mean, I like that culture, and I suppose that's a culture I've always been into since I was a teenager. But during the pandemic, the you know, leaders in that culture have just been sharing them, what I consider to be harmful conspiracy theories. And you see that within this culture that's very up for ecstatic experiences, which is cool, but there's a lack of critical thinking, and that's fine when you're not in a pandemic, but when you're in a public health crisis, you really rate people's ability to think critically. So I've seen, you know, leaders in New Age cultures, yes, you know, sharing really harmful, what I take to be really harmful conspiracy theories.
Yes. And
We've
both had to deal with, in our own experience of specific Jewish thought leaders and spiritual guru types, like the shadows. You know, there's a specific rabbi that we both, you know, adore, you know, deeply, his Torah and his music and his teachings. I think Eli is like definitely like an expert when it comes to this particular thinker. His name is Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach. And there's been a reckoning in the broader community around his sort of, you know, contending with his behavior with women, contending with his behavior as sort of like a grandiose spiritual guru type figure, like taking abuses of power, and sort of recognizing that like humans be humans, right? That like humans are gonna human all over the place. And we're seeing it now, you know, so many in the medical field. You're seeing it now as a result of the pandemic, in the political sphere, in the religious sphere, in the technological sphere. When you're talking to people like the Zuckerbergs and the Tim Cooks and all these people who, you know, you're like, you might want to look at them and be like, wow, they've done so well in the system. They've won the game. They're the most uber wealthy, and therefore we should aspire to be like them. But then when you get down to it, you're like, oh, wait a minute, like, we don't want to hold these people up as examples, even though they hold themselves above everyone else through their massive accumulation of wealth. And so it sort of like shines a light on the fact that like at all times, whatever you're engaging with, you have to bring that critical eye. You have to be willing to hold dissonance. And I think something that I've been trying to do in my work, you know, as an educator and as a budding thought leader in certain ways, is to help people learn how to hold dissonance from a very young age, to maybe even some people might say developmentally too soon, but to start just like introducing the concept that two things could happen at the same time, be dissonant with each other, and that can be difficult, but you have to be able to hold them both in order to be present with sort of the complexity of this life. Otherwise, you're going to fall into these traps of just like, oh, they said demon semen created this plague, but they're a doctor, so I should listen to them. And it's just like, you know, it's very easy to fall down the wrong.
Yeah, right. And I think, and you see that on Twitter every day. All the evil is on the other side. All the virtue is on my side. You know, so yeah.
Jonathan Haidt, the author, if you have read any of his work, I mean, he's really excellent at highlighting this through his work on disgust. When he went to India and did a lot of research on ritual purity, impurity, and sort of how that same conversation is happening now, you know, with the woke culture, and sort of how it's taken this uber religious tone to it that people within that group would deny, be like, no, we're not religious. Those people are religious, but the way that they're going about advocating for their perspective is done in with this like fervent religiosity that they can't even necessarily see themselves.
Yes, exactly. And Jonathan Haidt has one of the few psychologists who's really studied like self-transcendence, and he's talked about recently his own psychedelic experiences. And he's written on like things like Stoicism. So the first book I wrote, Philosophy for Life, by the way, was about the Socratic and the rationalist and it was very, it was very popular with the kind of atheist rationalist crowd. And this was really the sister book. So this was about these two sides, the Socratic and the Dionysiac, the rational and the ecstatic.
Which is interesting because Nietzsche would have put Apollonian next to Dionysiac, not necessarily Socratic.
Yeah. I mean, so that book I was obsessed by, The Birth of Tragedy. I was obsessed by that at school and at university. My lecturers at university, or my tutors, would tick me off because every essay I'd bring in like the Dionysiac and the Apollonian, and it would be predictable. They get bored of it. They're like, when's it going to happen? But yeah, so it was trying to, these two sides. And I guess I was more into like the idea of the Socratic and the Dionysiac, but it's similar, basically inspired by kind of Nietzsche's idea.
I think the Jewish conception of that like duality would probably be more akin to Socratic and Epicurean, because and that rabbinic Jewish philosophy and teaching actually falls much more on the Socratic side than it does on the Epicurean side, to the point where like the word Epikuros, which is like someone who's like an apostate basically, comes from the root, like the name Epicurean. So like anyone who ascribed to the Epicurean philosophy and to that perspective of, that they were being exposed to in the Hellenistic period, the rabbis were like, no. Like, if we're going to fall on any side, we're going to fall with the Socratic side. We're going to fall on the Aristotelian side, not this sort of experiential, sensual, direct encounter with sensory input kind of philosophy.
So you're saying that the more ecstatic aspect of Jewish culture would be called Epicurean?
No. Epikuros means heretic.
Okay, it does it. Okay.
You hear the root of the word.
Yeah.
Epikuros, Epicurean.
Okay. Gotcha.
Also, like, the Jews are just like everybody else, but more so. So
yeah.
If we think about our thought, I mean, at that time, like when rabbinic Judaism was in its infancy, that's during a Hellenistic period, Jewish mysticism really comes about in like the Golden Age of Spain, when you have like Sufi mysticism is revolving around it. That's when Jewish mysticism really starts to flourish.
Yeah.
And then it's kind of exported to like the city of Tzfat in Israel, and then Hegel kind of like picks up on it. Hegel in like his like thesis, antithesis, synthesis, that's like very much so coming out of this Islamic Jewish Kabbalah with triad, things like that. Our theology is in line just with everybody else's.
Yeah. Okay. I want to ask you guys as a kind of I'd love to hear your kind of thoughts on this about where you think. I can tell you that in the Christian church, there's hardly anyone thinking about psychedelics and their possible place within Christian rituals and Christian community. You can count the people who are on one hand, and no one senior, certainly in the Church of England. I don't know what it's like in American churches. In South America, it's different, of course. You got whole churches which have some kind of syncretism of animist, Christian, psychedelic. But tell me about your kind of thoughts and ideas and explorations on the kind of psychedelic Judaism and what it looks like and what it could look like, and whether you think there could be a role for what would that be like? Oh, you're frozen.
It's a great question. It's something that I've thought a lot about and continue to think a lot about. It's really like the thing I think about the most right now in the world. Like, so where I'm at right now in August 2020 is that Judaism provides a spiritual technology which allows for the users and the implementers of that technology to engage with the elevation and the sacramental, sort of the sacralization of time. Psychedelics are primarily a transient, time-bound experience. like the half-life of something like a tab of LSD is between 8 and 12 hours, something like that. An ayahuasca experience. I haven't done it, but I know it's it's a whole multiple hour thing.
No, it's not. It's like it's about 4 hours.
Oh, great! So it's great. So but we're still in the realm of time. We're talking, in a time-bound experience. And Judaism as a spiritual technology really creates a lot of ritual components which help people transition into and out of sanctified, elevated time. Abraham Joshua Heschel really talks about the architecture of time, and Judaism as providing architectures for time as opposed to architectures of space. And the thing that I believe that psychedelics afford the people that engage with them is an infusing of the significance of everything. Because once you sort of deal with the whatever serotonin, dopamine imbalances, which might be creating this existential itch for something more, something better, something additional. Once those are sort of attended to by some of the mechanistic components of classical psychedelics, so the mind isn't necessarily searching or looking for something that will make it feel complete and at whole. Then it can sort of sit with and look around and observe that everything holds potential significance of the most insane quantity that one might not even consider, which is why some people liken it to insanity, because they're like, how can it be that everything I'm looking at feels totally significant? Mm-hmm. But Judaism doesn't actually provides a language and a method for contending with that significance, and for contending with, for this period of time, whether it's like a Sabbath, like Shabbat going from Friday night to Saturday night, or a holiday, which is like several days, that this time is different. And so the things that we experience during this time are allowed to feel different. And that could be more significant, less significant, more holy, less holy, whatever. But something is going to change in this time period. And we're going to provide a language and a ritual structure and a community basis to process and integrate that difference of experience.
Right.
And it is vested in thousands of years of practice and study and thought and examination that lend itself very well to the beginner or to the beginner voyager who is searching for an opportunity to feel like everything matters more than they believed. This especially comes up for people in end of life care, people who are dealing with depression, anxiety, who might feel being stuck in these loops of nothing matters. I'm insignificant, nothing I do matters, everything is hopeless, da, da, da. But then the psychedelics actually remove that, temporarily seem to remove that set of conversations internally and replace them with an invitation to consider your personal significance in the universe, the nature, significance of community, the significance of the interconnectivity of all things. But then the question is, the container that a person is doing in and is having that experience in, does it allow for the weirdness? Something that people often say about psychedelics, I think, is that they can't necessarily they can deal with the bliss and the euphoria, but the weirdness is a little too much. But Judaism doesn't shy away from the weirdness. Judaism leans into the weirdness and says that the weirdness is just what you feel is weird is actually potentially just you sensing that this time that you're in is different somehow. And that difference in time can be processed as an elevated sense of time, as opposed to sort of a distorted sense of time. So moving from the distorted to the elevated is something that Judaism does very well. And I think has a lot of potential to clinical settings, to therapeutic settings, to recreational settings, and spiritually consistent settings with, retreats and centers and things like that are going to come up in the future. So yeah, those are some of my thoughts of where we're at now.
On a very practical level, no one's talking. It's like there's I think, and there's a lot of excitement and energy in the niche group. Group is in a lot of ways, there are people who are well establishing themselves to be the leaders of tomorrow. I wouldn't be surprised if we were having this conversation in 10 or 15 years and we're going to say, you can see the sliver of very well established part of Jewish practice, which is entheogenic. Now, no one in terms of like major Jewish institutional leadership is this on their radar. Now, it happens to be that many Jews in America are kind of like of ilk who are reading Michael Pollan's book and thinking, oh, this is interesting, like maybe this is a thing we could be doing, but no one's yet thinking of like, oh, I'm so excited the time I go to synagogue and that's those experiences. I don't think people are really know anything about it. There is like some leaders.
So I'm a moderator for the group on Facebook, the Jewish Entheogenic Society, which is a growing community of psychedelically, entheogenically inclined Jewish people from across the spectrum of practice and observance and within the mainstream institution, outside the mainstream institution, who are all interested in building a container to have conversations right now. We're just trying to open up dialogue and learn from each other. Boomers, millennials, Gen Xers, so it's a diverse, small niche group. And I think as the status of the legality changes, the sort of, if you are aware of the Overton window concept, right? That like right now we're still in the Jewish community in taboo space generally, but within the next 10, 15 years, we're going to really see these conversations move in the Overton window of acceptable Jewish conversation in mainstream circles. And my hope is that by the time that happens, that someone like me is already ready to be sitting at a table with a good amount of learning and research and practice to bring to the table, and that we're not playing. What I really want to avoid is that the Jewish community is playing catch up with the rest of the world. That once the rest is on board with psychedelics as an acceptable form of therapeutic and spiritual growth and practice and healing, that we're not like waiting until everyone else is doing it and they're like, oh, we have something to say, but that we should really be at the conversation, at the table at the very beginning, because what we have to offer as a spiritual technology is valuable and in some ways is the indigenous tradition of the Western Christian mindset. It's not, the indigenous Christians were Jews, in many ways. Jesus was Jewish, and Jesus was talking like a Jew, not like a Christian from my perspective. His disciples and the writers after him were speaking like Christians, but Jesus was speaking as a Jew. And so what does that mean? And we help elevate those conversations with the practice of those who have been keeping the tradition alive all this time, and have been keeping their ear to the ground and getting themselves ready to talk about this.
Very good. I mean, and I can imagine a kind of pathway of like psychedelic therapy is becoming legalized, psychedelics are becoming decriminalized, more people are having mystical experiences on psychedelics, which is leading to a kind of change in attitude and an openness to spiritual traditions, and will gradually lead to people reconnecting probably with maybe their inherited faiths or deepening their connection to other faiths as well. I think you're right that Western Buddhism, because they're kind of relatively new and young traditions, Western Buddhism, run by baby boomers, and they've been
many of whom were Jews.
Many of them were Jews, absolutely, and many of whom were trippers. Like most of the Western Buddhist teachers, they came to it through psychedelics, like Jack Cornfield, Jonah Halifax, and so on. Ram Dass, yeah. So there's been an overlap between psychedelics and Western Buddhism, but I think you're right. It's so rich to bring in the other traditions, and Alan Watts had a vision of Jesus, to his surprise, when he first took LSD, I think, and wrote a beautiful description of it. So yeah, I just really look forward to that. I really hope it happens, and I really look forward to it over the next 20 years. And I would love to come to your psychedelic synagogue.
Yeah.
I can see it.
Yes.
And I'm going to put you in touch with some people here in the UK, with the 5 people thinking and working on this stuff here in the UK. So because they'd love to, I'm sure, be in touch with you too, and I think you'd have interesting conversations with them as well.
Yeah, I think when I imagine what the next few steps are, you know, in the more immediate term, I imagine that there's going to be a center in a state in the United States where these things become decriminalized and become sort of expanded access for therapeutic use, in which it's sort of like a retreat center that's going to be set in a rural natural setting, where there are going to be a staff of psychotherapists, rabbis, social workers, and clinicians, and like researchers, who are going to be working together to create an environment for people to come who are dealing with, at first, trauma, PTSD, treatment-resistant depression, end-of-life anxiety, sort of the already accepted demographics for people who can engage with these things. But it's going to be happening in a context, like a residential context, where there will be Jewish professionals employed to provide the containers for the preparation and for the integration. The experience itself, I don't actually think is going to take a lot of Jewish character to it. There might be a few sort of like toys and Jewish ritual objects that are incorporated in as things to investigate in the midst of an experience. But really, where I think we have the most to offer right now is helping people prepare for an important experience and helping people integrate after an important experience. And then to allow the clinicians and the psychotherapists to really preside over the experience itself, to make sure that it adheres to the regulatory standards that will allow it to grow and sort of embed itself in acceptable society.
And the last thing I just want to throw in, just from responding to what you said, I just edited a book just this year, co-edited it. And it was called Breaking Open, Finding a Way Through Spiritual Emergency. And I touched on this topic in this book about spiritual emergencies. I think it was in the first chapter or the second chapter, about mystical experiences that are difficult and take a long time to integrate, and could be months or years. And they're often a real challenge to one's theology. Like I've friends who are who've gone through, for example, like midlife meltdowns, and they are these will be both very beautiful experiences for an extended time, could be a year, but also very destabilizing waves of anxiety, feelings of like ego death and walking through the valley of darkness, really not being sure where you are on the path. Are you going forward or not? And I guess I was interested to do this book, and this book is like 14 people's stories, because I think as people do psychedelics more, and as people do contemplative practices more people are going to have mystical experiences, but not all of those are going to be easy. Some of them are difficult, because what you're doing is you're going beyond your ordinary ego in a culture where still people are not used to people going beyond their egos, and they so there's all kinds of challenges there. And as you say, there's a lack of guides, there's a lack of maps. So everyone in our book on the whole were either Buddhist or spiritual but not religious. And by the end of this book, I was very interested in how other cultures make sense of dark nights of the soul, and of spiritual emergencies. And I think of stuff like the Book of Job, or I think about Ezekiel lying on his side for however many days, and I guess the kind of the darkness of the prophetic tradition, and the ups and downs of the Jewish relationship with God, I think is interesting, and you get that in the Psalms as well. So I'd just be curious about what you guys think about that. Have you come across that among your friends or so on, like people who have difficult trips, say, difficult mystical experiences, and do you think that Judaism, old or new, has resources that can help people with those kinds of difficult mystical experiences?
Great question. I'm curious how that question hits you.
I can only answer the second part of it. I don't think specifically. I haven't spoken with anyone who specifically had bad trips or had bad trips and tried to use Jewish practice as a way. I think part of the reason I've only had positive, in my mind, I think the only reason positive mystical experiences is because people couched them in this ritualistic way that we've built. And that's allowed me, like, it wasn't that there weren't difficult parts of the experiences, but I was able to easily move through them in a positive manner.
Right. When there's a shadow, you move.
Right. Storm clouds gather, move.
Right.
Like we have like these phrases we use, and then there's also this like, yeah. So I think using that technology, it's like, what's the phrase? If all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Also, if you're a nail, everything looks like a hammer. It goes both ways. So to have like a full toolkit, I mean, any of our spiritual traditions can be a toolkit, and then it's about being well trained in the tools. I also have a prayer practice that I do every day. That's a well trained. I'm well trained in that tool, such that when I get to a point where I'm having a mystical, powerful, ecstatic experience, if I need to rely on that tool, it's like the back of my hand. It's easy, and I can use it, and then I don't need to. I feel like I'm less prone to fall into a bad mystical experience or a difficult mystical experience because of that, and that's where I think training comes from.
Right. I think specifically around tripping, it's a skill, right? Tripping is a skill that you get better at the more you do it, right? And it's, it doesn't mean that every experience is the same. They're actually usually always different, but the skills that you practice in the moments where things become challenging and which are inevitable, and the moments where things become overwhelming, which is inevitable, that you put in the time outside of those periods to practice the kind of solid, rigorous training, usually of a contemplative tradition or, a prayer practice or something that sort of you jump on the train tracks when you need that stability, right? And I think that for the people that I'm aware of who have had sort of quote unquote dark nights of the soul, it's because they didn't have any of that going into their experiences. And unfortunately, I would say most of the experiences I'm aware of were not spontaneous. They were induced, right? And so they went in knowing that they didn't have recourse for a bad turn, but they did it anyway, thinking that it either wasn't going to happen or that they could handle it or whatever. But then I think they quickly realized that it really pays to do your homework outside of those experiences. And the homework could be years. It could be years between two induced mystical experiences in which you're just doing the daily grind of just practicing the things that you can then rely on to extricate yourself from a challenging mystical experience, which could be like completely destabilizing. The ones that I'm aware of where they didn't have those practices, they didn't do their homework, maybe because they were cavalier, or maybe they were naive. I don't know. Maybe they just, or I think often it's because they just didn't know that that's something they could be working on. And I think something that I want to sort of put out into the world is that there are things that you can be working on that especially if you're a Jew, that you actually can inherit just by virtue of the fact that you are part of this legacy and tradition that can be there for you when you need them, but only if you know that they're there. So like a lot of this stuff is in the storehouses covered in dust, like in the Raiders of the Lost Ark, but no one's going in to get the boxes out, and it's sort of just stuck in there right now for a lot of people.
So no one ever thought of the kind of, this is going to lead to a reevaluation of the Torah as a kind of guide to, a toolkit for tripping. This is going to get young people
that language is scary to me. I think what I would say is the Torah is a guide to our life.
Yeah.
Period. And a mystical experience can be an aspect of our life. And if it's something that we're looking for, then the Torah is the blueprint for how to live in every situation.
Right.
And therefore it has something to teach us in this aspect as well.
And what now? I have often used the language of, and so did Aldous Huxley, the language of like technologies, and we both use that as well. And I think that is a language that our culture is comfortable with now, particularly like Silicon Valley culture, which is a culture that's very interested in the ecstatic, but will often, to some extent, instrumentalize it. You know, hey, microdose for innovation kind of thing, or take ayahuasca to kind of find your mission statement. What do you think about that? Like, I suppose that when I hear the word like technology or tool, and I just use the word toolkit, it feels like that's an instrumental thing rather than a relational thing. As in, would you, you know, like, and then there's also the question of what do you connect to? What do you meet in this place? Is it something separate to us? And is it is everything in that space friendly? And this is a you know, I would point your attention, if you haven't come across it, because you'll find it fascinating. A debate between, a debate is a too friendly a word from it. It was an argument between the psychedelic researcher Rick Strassman and Bill Richards, he was a researcher at Johns Hopkins. Have you come across this debate?
Well, Bill Richards wrote Sacred Knowledge, I think, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I haven't seen the argument, but I mean, they're two people whose content I'm aware of, and yeah.
Yeah, so Strassman says that the theology of Johns Hopkins is very Christian Buddhist, and the theology really of Aldous Huxley, and is somewhat, I think he suggested it was anti-Semitic because it devalued I-thou encounters. And Strassman's take is that the Old Testament is very useful for psychedelic experience because it gives a kind of ability not to navigate the space, but also to defend oneself. After he did his famous DMT experiments in the 80s, which he had to call off because people were having, you know, non-consensual erotic encounters with alligators and stuff like that. So he's into like the idea of basically that in the spirit zone, not everything is friendly. And therefore it's useful to have protection. And I suppose in the same way that indigenous shamans might talk about that. So I put this to, you know, the head of the Johns Hopkins lab, like in the psychedelic clinics of the future, do you need to like protect people from bad spirits? You know, is that a thing? And he was like, well, we wouldn't encourage anyone to believe in bad spirits. That wouldn't be a belief we'd encourage. But what if people have, you know, trips where they do feel they encounter like bad spirits? Anyway, I don't know why. I suppose I'm just, I guess because in some ways we haven't talked about that in this conversation, particularly about the other, the other as in God or angels, or, you know, just the non-human encounters with the non-human. And I don't know what you guys, what's your take on that? As for me, I would say that I've stopped trying to answer what the non-human is. It's beyond me. Even the human I find complicated enough. So, but you know, I've also haven't done psychedelics in 3 years, and you know, what do you think? And let's, because I better go after this, but just as a kind of a nice, easy closing topic, what do you think about like the non-human and you know, do we encounter it, and is that how? What do you think of that encounter?
Walking to the woods. Oh! And I run over, and he was like, look at it, it's like a deer. And we like see this deer, I'm like, wow. And then another time he was like, oh! And I ran over and I was like, what do you see? And he went, God.
Yeah, it's just yeah, I remember that very well. I think, I feel as though encounters with the non-human don't try to, like, they don't try to make sense, so I don't try to make sense of them.
Mm-hmm.
So I try to keep in Jewish practice, sometimes in prayer practice, we have this thing called the mechitza, which is sort of like a dividing wall that in many prayer settings you'll find between the genders. There'll be like a male section, a female section, and a mechitza between them. And sort of, I really try, in my own experiences, specifically, I would say in the float tanks where I've sort of engaged with different types of consciousness in that particular sensory deprived setting. Similar to, like, I tried to go like down the path of like Dr. John C. Lilly a little bit, just to see what he was doing for myself. And like
John Lilly.
Yeah, I try to make a mechitza, like a separation barrier wall between everything that is within my remit of human knowledge and understanding and the things that I experience, which do not qualify for being approached from that way. And they get their own universe. They get their own space. You know what I mean? I often look at, I watch those documentaries of like the deep sea and like all these fish down there that are like bioluminescent and like look like freaking aliens. And I'm like, oh wait, we live with aliens. There are actually more of them than there are of us. We live on their planet. We live on the alien. You know, like we're just the little monkeys running around on the surface crust, whereas there's way more alien fish down below us, you know, in terms of numbers. And so why would I imagine that like I somehow should be able to contend with and make sense of the experiences that I have through some of these modalities, and that if I can't, that they're somehow, you know, bad or threatening or attempting to like tear me down, or they're just like trying to be known. Like I think something that I've heard from a lot of people and that I felt myself is that these non-human experiences just want to be known. They want to be seen, and they want to be welcomed. But oftentimes it gets dark when there is a lack of that barrier, and I'm forcing my making sense proclivity onto it.
Okay.
And then it does not take kindly to that approach, that type of approach. It will actually in defense, like push back and attack against me if I try to. But if I just like watch and accept and allow, and I take this from my experiences and the reports I've had from other people, watching and accepting and allowing from that sort of like, you know, westernized Theravadan perspective of just like being the observer, that oftentimes, you know, the things that happen to you, you end up surviving the things that happen to you in those encounters. Like you come back, and but then when you come back, you're in that mindset of, what was that? How do I understand it? Like again, it has to go back to that abiding in the mystery and just being like, that was mysterious. Like, okay, like I accept that it was mysterious. I accept that maybe I didn't learn anything that I can like now do utilitarian. Like it won't help me make a better spoon or a better mug, but it'll help me be okay with when things feel more uncertain in my life, or when things feel more up in the air or a little bit more chaotic. I'll just have a little bit more wherewithal to just be with it. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's the whole point. I don't know. So that's how that feels to me.
Well, I enjoyed this. Thanks for inviting me. It was it was really nice to do. I think you guys should do this again with it. I mean, like, or have you done it again? Have you done it with other books?
No.
You should. No. You know, you could do it. I think it would be a good kind of, you know, like a YouTube channel. What author would not like to be invited to a kind of ritual and to, you know, have interesting conversations? So, you know, yeah, I think you should. It's a nice thing to do.
Yeah, I think there's something there.
Yeah,
I think we're there.
Yeah.
To be fair, it took us, you know, since April to read through the book. So
yeah. I'm not saying there's going to be, you know, it's going to be a slow burner.
But then over the course of a number of years, there'll be like a body of content, maybe. Who knows?
Yeah. I think it'd be great. Oh, well, okay, guys. I'll be in touch. I'll send you an email, and I'll put you in touch with some other people who I think would be.
Let's just do one more toast with your tea. We'll do with our little champagne of beers here. Just to close out with just an ending ritual. Just thank you for learning. Thank you for the experience that you provided for us and for all the research that went into this. We feel like we found like a kindred spirit in you and through your words and through this encounter here. So hopefully we can continue to learn from each other and engage in an ongoing conversation about how we can help bring more ecstatic experiences and ecstatic conversations into a West that I think is now more than ever like really thirsty for it and really could benefit a lot from it.
And let me say to you guys, thank you. That a book only comes alive when it finds careful readers who give it attention. And it reminds me of those kind of paper flowers. You put them in water and they unfold and expand. So I thank you very much for that. It makes me happy. And look forward to kind of talking again.
Great. Cheers. Thanks, Jules. Cheers. All the best, Jules. Be well.
All the best. Take care, guys. See ya.